Okay, folks, I got a message from a viewer who asked me to take a look back at some comments I made about the DC series Identity Crisis back in 2002. I mean, all the way back in 2002. I don't even remember what my opinion of Identity Crisis was back in 2002. So I decided to read through the series again just to make sure I could speak intelligently to the viewer's points, and I realized that there were some things to point out about Identity Crisis that I think could have been done better. Now, Identity Crisis was a 7-issue series by DC Comics involving the Justice League characters. It's a murder mystery by Brad Meltzer and Rags Morales. Brad Meltzer has done several mystery novels. I believe this is his first foray into the comic book world, though. And so basically, he crafted a mystery for the DC Comics universe to solve. And the artist is Rags Morales, who has done a brilliant job on this series. And I am going to take a look at one particular thing up front at the beginning of Identity Crisis number 1. Now, this is an event book, so this is supposed to draw in a whole bunch of readers, and I'll be addressing some obstacles to that a little bit later on. But right now, I want to focus on the opening scene in Identity Crisis number 1, where we're told we are watching a scene taking place in Opal City. 30 minutes till now, Ralph Dibny and Lorraine Riley, co-workers. Okay, so we know we're opening on a scene in Opal City. It's 30 minutes till some future event, and then you've got Ralph and Lorraine who are co-workers. I want to focus on this timing aspect because this is something that I've seen recently in another completely unrelated work, but one that you're probably familiar with hearing about from me, and that is ISOM number 1. If you look at the first page of ISOM number 1, what you will see is a heading on the page. It's a city scene where you see people walking around in front of various city buildings, and the captioning reads, West Florispark 2 weeks ago. Now, what's interesting about ISOM number 1, and by interesting I mean this kind of sucks, is that you never actually experience 2 weeks of time in the book. So I don't understand why this is supposedly set 2 weeks ago, as if the whole book is happening in some unspecified past. Now, thankfully, within Identity Crisis, we don't suffer from that. We do actually get into the full 30 minutes, so that now is experienced within the comic book itself. But with ISOM being 2 weeks ago, this is one of these conceits that I think a lot of writers fall into when they're just getting kind of a little bit loosey-goosey with time. Now, the reason that we have a 30 minutes from now thing in the first place is because we are going to jump forward after the initial opening scene to 3 more scenes in succession where we experience what's going on in the rest of the world now. So it's 30 minutes from the point that we just left, and now we're getting to see 3 different scenes, one in Smallville with Superman and his parents, one in Gotham City with Nightwing and his ex-girlfriend at the gravesite of his parents, and then we have a boxing training with Green Arrow and his son, who also goes by Green Arrow. And what we're going to find is that something terrible has happened. When that 30-minute mark hits, there's going to be something that is so shocking that it is going to go all around to all of these different cities and alert the various members of the Justice League and so forth, and they're going to be shocked at what happens. So basically, we've got 30 minutes from now is where we start, or 30 minutes till now is where we start, and then now is what we jump to, and when we jump back, we're now at the 17 minutes till now point, and then it becomes a countdown. And so in various panels throughout the next few pages of the book, you see the time counting down. 17 minutes till now, 14 minutes till now, 12 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. And so the suspense is building, and then you finally get to this scene, or at least I thought you finally get to this scene, where you see what looks like kind of a stopwatch, and with the face shattered, and you see the panic in the hero's voice saying, "Fly me home now." And at first I thought that this was actually a very, very good way to transition out of these static captions into dialogue. Now, unfortunately, I'm wrong on two respects. First of all, that's not a stopwatch. That's a magnifying glass. It was there's a magnifying glass shown earlier in the series. It gets dropped during one of the pivotal moments in the book, and it shatters on the ground. Moreover, that now has nothing to do with the countdown because after this panel, we get to see another panel saying 30 seconds till now until we finally get to the now. Now, here's the problem that I have with the use of this countdown sequence. It keeps the reader watching the clock instead of the action. You don't really want the reader doing that. What you want to have in any kind of comic book or any kind of movie is not a fixation on time's passage. You want the reader to be immersed in the comic so that the reader is front and present and fully engaged with the content. You don't want a clock watcher, you want an action watcher. You want somebody who is thoroughly engrossed in what's actually happening in the scene, not just focused on those panels. Because what I remember when I was reading through those panels, I'm like, okay, is here the next countdown one? Is here the next countdown one? Instead of just enjoying what's there on the page to be seen, whether it's one of the two primary superheroes fighting and such. You don't know. You're not focused. You're not focused on what the action that's happening on the page. Instead, you're looking back at the clock instead of being fully immersed. So I would have fixed this pretty simply, because what you start off with is setting the clock at 30 minutes till now and then jumping to these three other scenes that are set in the now. Easy way to fix this is just basically make now, or the first scene, the now, and then turn every one of these scenes that are set into the now into a future scene. We're now looking at a now that we open on, and then we're looking at 30 minutes from now. We're jumping forward 30 minutes to find out that something terrible has happened. And so when we go back to this portion, we don't have to have this countdown telling us how close we're getting to now. Instead, we can get rid of all of these and just live exclusively in the now. We went from the now, we went to 30 minutes in the future when something terrible has happened, and now we're back in the now, and we can experience that 30 minutes of action and just be fully engrossed in the action. That, I think, is the better way to have done this first half of the book. The only other things that I wanted to bring up about Identity Crisis #1, since they're there to be seen, is there's a little bit of issue with names and accessibility. First, we're introduced to this opening panel in which we have the first two characters, Ralph Dibny and Lorraine Riley. Now, this is the Elongated Man and Firehawk. We learn that a little bit later on. From this dialogue sequence, however, you can't tell who is speaking in these. I don't know whether it's Ralph Dibny or Lorraine Riley speaking the first dialogue balloon, the third dialogue balloon, and the fifth dialogue balloon. Likewise, I don't know whether it's Ralph Dibny or Lorraine Riley who's speaking the second and the fourth dialogue balloons. I have no idea. So how am I supposed to know? How am I supposed to know who's who? I mean, even when I get to the next panels, I don't know who uttered any of these particular lines. And so I think that is a problem. Now, it's not so huge of a problem just because there's nothing really important being said in here, but it would be nice to have just any idea what's in it Ralph or any idea what's in it Lorraine, just so that we know who's speaking, because you do kind of want to figure out what character do you assign what attributes of the dialogue to. For example, in this case, we have curiosity as the feature of the leftmost dialogue balloons. And then you have, a little bit of curiosity on the other side, but not so much. A little bit focus on racial demographics a little bit. So wouldn't it be nice to know that Ralph is the one saying the dialogue balloons on the left and Lorraine is the one saying the dialogue balloons on the right? Now, as far as that middle caption where it says Dr. Fate once told me life is a mystery, you can probably save the identification of who it is that's speaking with that a little bit later. And the fact that that Ralph Dibny has a red uniform and then these dialogue or these captions where he's thinking have a red tinge to them, that can kind of link things up. So that's not terrible, but at the same time, it would be nice if we at least had a little bit of identification in the dialogue balloons as to who's talking. Something similar comes up in a later caption where he's talking about it's different in real life. In real life, anyone can get hurt. That's why I left the league. Barry, Hal, Vivian, and Constance. Too many funerals. I actually gave a copy of Identity Crisis to a couple of my friends for Christmas. And one of the things that they reported back to me was they found the comic to not be very accessible. Reason being that they didn't recognize a lot of these names. They didn't know that when they meant Barry Allen, that Barry, that was a reference to Barry Allen, the Flash. They didn't know that Hal was a reference to Hal Jordan, Green Lantern. They weren't comic book fans, and so they didn't immediately recognize these names. And they certainly, by no means, I barely did, recognize Vivian and Constance, who were two twin sisters who inhabited the role of the Crimson Fox. So the and all these characters have died, so they didn't know that either, although it's implied in here that it's their funerals he's talking about. But this was something that wound up being a barrier to my friends getting in, and so the use of first names constantly through the book, which is perpetuated throughout the series, without identifying the superheroes necessarily that belong to those particular names. That wound up being an impediment to people who were not used to reading comics. And the fact that this is an event book means that you're going to encounter a lot of people who are not used to reading comics. So this is where people find a jumping off point is in an event, or a jumping on point is in an event book. So if you're going to bring people into an event book, you're going to want to make that as accessible as possible. And this first name usage, without kind of cluing people in on who that actually means, was problematic. At least it was for my friends. I don't know that you might have friends who said they found it accessible just fine, but I find that hard to believe. There's also a little bit of an excursion that Brad Meltzer takes into caring about characters and the fear of death in novels. It says, in a novel, it's different. There you start worrying about the main character's safety almost immediately. Of course, it's a false worry. Nothing bad really ever happens to the main character in a novel. But if the story opens with a minor character or two, okay, now, this is interesting just in the sense that Ralph Dibny and Lorraine Riley, the elongated man and Firehawk, they are themselves minor characters. So what opening with minor characters does, what Brad Meltzer is saying here, is that you can actually legitimately fear for what is going to happen to this character because it's not somebody who's like a main stage character. And that's especially true. They used this technique in a later series. It was DC's Countdown to Infinite Crisis, ironically, a countdown book. But in Countdown to Infinite Crisis, you know that there is a DC character who's going to die in the book. And when you open the first page, you see the DC character who is going to be the narrator of the story. And when you see that character and you realize this is not an A-list character, then it's immediately believable that something bad, up to and including death, could happen to this character. So and sure enough, basically, I don't want to spoil the ending, but your fears are justified. So in that case where you have a minor character, and here in Identity Crisis, you have a couple of minor characters where you can honestly worry about whether either one of them is going to come out of this alive. If for example, that Countdown issue had opened with Batman, well, nothing bad or nothing permanently bad is going to happen to Batman. He'll be back in some way, shape, or form. They're not going to kill the character off. They've tried so many different times, and every single time they've brought him back. But you open up with a minor character, well, all bets are off. And that's basically what Brad Meltzer is trying to establish here. Although I have to take issue with the fact that he says in a novel, it's a false worry to worry about the main character because nothing bad ever really happens to the main character. I can think of so many novels I've read, especially in horror novels, or even some detective mystery novels, where terrible things have happened to the main character in a novel. I've seen the main character in a novel get shot in the face and suffer permanent facial injury. I've seen the main character in a novel get raped. I mean, there's all sorts of bad things that can happen to the main character in a novel. Now, if you're dealing with a novel that has more than one main character, that makes it easier for something really bad to happen to that main character. But if you're dealing with a main character who is the focus, then and you know that main character is going to be a mainstay of the book, well then yeah, it's harder to make bad things happen to that character, but it's still not impossible. I mean, like the character who I was talking about who got shot in the face, that character was the lead of the book, but that the shooting in the face is something that takes place early on and winds up being something transformational for the character. The character has to relocate, do other, find other things to do, etc., etc. So that winds up being part of the story, but it still kind of puts the lie to the idea that nothing bad really happens to the main character in a novel, and I'm just kind of surprised that Brad Meltzer would want to go down that road, being a novel writer himself. The last thing that I wanted to bring out is that Raj Morales' portrayal of Superman has the worst posture I've ever seen, especially when he's being lectured by his mother. I mean, he's just he's cringy there to the point of obsequiousness. Now, I know, I mean, they're basically saying that he's a good mama's boy, but does he have to be that much of a good mama's boy? I mean, my God. So yeah, I look at this portrayal of Superman, and it's like it's almost one of these where you don't quite respect him the same way after seeing him in this kind of posture. So that's basically what I wanted to say about my review of Identity Crisis #1, mostly focusing on the timeline and the countdown feature and how that can really be a distraction rather than something that focuses the reader's attention on the action. And then I wanted to throw in a couple of miscellaneous bits that I had seen there. So I'm going to continue reading on through Identity Crisis. If I find something else that I think is worthy of pointing out, I will do so, and then I'll have to get back to to answering the questions about my 20-year-old opinions on Identity Crisis. So that will be a fun time, I'm sure. I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for watching, and please do subscribe if you haven't already. If you found this video useful, please share it to Twitter where I can't, and hook up with me on Gab, which is my latest social media haunt. And thank you again for watching. I will talk to you later.